The 26th of February of also 1562, the fathers met in the 18th session of the Council of Trent to arrange the order of matters to be examined. The political troubles which had delayed the progress of the assembly for so long had renewed with greater intensity, and this was as the council seemed to draw near its close. So the various political problems, the pretensions of princes, questions of precedence among ambassadors of different courts, claims put forward by Protestants, various aims of Catholic princes who wished to assure the ascendancy of their own views, their interests, personal ambition even. Those were all obstacles that were getting in the way of the continued work of the council. So, human failures affect everything. The 19th and 20th sessions were spent battling those difficulties, so they were consumed with political matters more than anything else. And it was finally on the 16th of July that the 21st session of the council resumed the series of dogmatic and disciplinary canons promulgated by the council. The question of communion under both kinds, so under both species, under both the appearance of bread and wine, which was so loudly claimed by the Lutheran and Calvinist, so-called reformers, was finally decided. So the council decreed, if anyone saith that each and every one of the faithful of Christ is obliged, by divine precept or by necessity of salvation, to receive the most holy sacrament of the Eucharist under both species, let him be anathema. If anyone saith that the Holy Catholic Church was not induced by just causes and reasons to communicate under the species of bread only, laymen, and also clerics when not consecrating, let him be anathema. So we've talked about this before, the reasons that the church had in the past to make those changes. Times when there were serious infectious diseases going around, it might not be the best idea to have everybody drinking from the same chalice. Sometimes we saw heretics would say that the true presence is not even truly there under the species of wine. So the church at one time required everybody to receive under both kinds in order to, as a profession of faith. Of course, today we have, aside from hygienic reasons, which are in fact a legitimate concern, even in times when people don't obsess over that, is in fact a legitimate concern. Today, now we also have, it's a profession of faith in receiving only under one kind. That's like a profession of adherence to this decree of the Council of Trent even, that to receive under only one species of bread only, for the faithful is in fact to receive the Eucharist whole and entire, undivided in any sense whatsoever. It's not like you're only half receiving the Eucharist or something if you receive only under bread. It's the Eucharist. It's indivisible. And yeah, this is actually a note from really past centuries, but the actual term Eucharist comes from the Greek verb to give thanks, which was we talked some time ago. It was really just in a tangent, but it's very interesting. We talked some time ago about how the discipline of the secret was kept in the early church. That was part of it, actually. Eucharist was almost a code word for the Blessed Sacrament, because again, they didn't want people going around saying they didn't want people calling it explicitly the flesh of Christ or the blood of Christ, because that would then have fueled the accusations of the pagan Romans of cannibalism. Whatever other accusations they gave them, we saw some of those too, but it would have fueled their accusations of cannibalism. So they gave it a code word, Thanksgiving. They also, terms like meeting, they would use terms like that also. It was the Holy Sacrifice of the Mass, and they had a correct understanding of what it actually was, but they were essentially code words. But even, of course, the term Eucharist we still use to this day, clearly. So they were words that they were used originally as code words, but they really stuck. Just today we just use them from custom, thousands of years of using them, but then also just really out of reverence, we continue to use them. Okay. So other anathemas, if anyone saith that the communion of the Eucharist is necessary for little children before they have reached the age of discretion, let him be anathema. So I'm saying no, but children do not need to receive the Holy Eucharist before reaching the age of reason. But then they said that, as to the two questions before proposed, but not yet discussed, which were specifically whether the reasons by which the Holy Catholic Church was led to give communion under the one species of bread only to laymen, and also to priests when not consecrating, which means, of course, but they're not actually saying Mass, are so to be observed that on no account is the use of the chalice to be allowed to anyone soever, and whether in that case, for just reasons founded on Christian charity, it were judged proper to grant the use of the chalice to any nation or kingdom. This concession should be made under certain conditions. And what those conditions should be, this same Holy Synod reserves them to another time. The earliest opportunity that shall present itself to be examined and defined. So essentially saying that this is a point of discipline, that it could be given in principle, the privilege or the custom, the practice could be granted to any nation or a group of people to use the chalice for the distribution of Holy Communion, even to the laity or to priests who are not actually saying Mass. That in principle that could be done. And in principle in itself, there's no problem with it. There's nothing offensive to the faith in that in itself. But essentially saying that for now, just Holy Communion for the layman and for priests not saying Mass under the species of bread only. And if there are any reasons for concessions, we'll put that question off to another time. But essentially making it clear that this is a question of discipline. So the council afterward referred its decision on this particular point to the sovereign pontiff to be regulated by him according to circumstances and conjectures. So at first they just put it off till later, and they say, no, just ask the Pope. That's easier. So then there was another decree on disciplinary reform, which comprised 9 chapters. The first is that bishops shall both confer orders and give demissorial letters and testimonials gratis. So in other words, can't charge anybody for ordination. Or what are also called demissorial letters. Is anybody familiar with demissorial letters? What those are? It's essentially a document or a demissorial letter is a document that a bishop of a diocese could give to another bishop to say, yes, this is a cleric of my diocese, but you can ordain him, or give any or tonsure, minor orders, anything to him. So that was required because the practice of incarnation, which today we imitate, you have to have an agreement, you have to have some kind of a contract with. It's all spelled out in the rule, but you have to have a contract with some priest, some bishop, some organization approved by the seminary in order to be tonsured. That's imitating the practice of incarnation to make sure that you don't have clerics just being ordained by any bishop anywhere and wandering around, saying Mass, doing various things, various activities of the apostolate without having any title of any decent support necessarily. So to avoid trouble, the Church instituted that practice of incarnation. You have to be attached to some place. So the rule then also became only bishops of a diocese could ordain bishops or priests for that diocese. And that if that bishop he could permit another bishop to do an ordination in his diocese, or for a cleric attached to his diocese, but he has to give this demissorial letters. So that's what that is. So, but this decree is saying specifically that bishops can't charge for that. In other words, gratis, for free. You have to do all those things without any charge. And then this, essentially what we just said, that no cleric shall be promoted to holy orders unless he holds some ecclesiastical benefice or patrimony sufficient for his honest livelihood. So again, there has to be some title of support. You can't be ordained here unless you have some place where after being ordained, you work at the seminary, or you go someplace else where there are sufficient means to support you. Of course, we don't pretend to actually incarnate. That's a canonical process that we don't have the jurisdiction to do, but we imitate the practice as closely as possible. So someone might hear it being referred to loosely as incarnation, but understand that it's strictly speaking not. Another decree, part of this decree, is that daily distributions are to be made among the canons who are present at the divine service. So this refers to, for one thing, I should explain that in Europe, the bishop of the diocese had a group of canons, the clergy of the cathedral church, who, in a way, shared the power of the bishop in certain ways. Well, for one thing, they would nominate the bishop, the next bishop, every time the bishop would die. They would nominate the next bishop. They would carry out an election and nominate the next candidate. And then, but they also had shared to a certain degree in the power of the bishop of the diocese. That they were very influential in the decision-making process that the bishop had. But then also, they had the obligation of singing the office every day in their cathedral church. So this decree says that they don't get their daily stipend unless they're actually present at the singing of the office. In fact, at least in some places, they would get their money as they were leaving, and they had to also be in their choir dress. So they couldn't just show up at the last second without even putting their choir robes on, get in, and then come out and get their money. No. They had to actually be present in their choir dress and everything. And as they were coming out, at least in some places that was the practice, that they would only then, as they were coming out, they would get their paycheck or whatever is the equivalent in the day. Talking about diocesan ordinaries, bishops of dioceses. Bishops are empowered to establish new parishes and to make unions of several benefices according to the spiritual wants of their respective dioceses. So essentially, within his own diocese, a bishop can rearrange things. He can set up new parishes. If one parish becomes too small for all the people in it, he can establish a new parish and divide up the work among priests that way. Or he can, if necessary, consolidate benefices, if necessary, for whatever reason. Again, all according to the spiritual needs of his diocese, whatever might be the case. So establishing that bishops do have the power to do that, definitely. Also, that bishops are to visit all of the churches of their diocese, even those which have before enjoyed the privilege of exemption. So, although just a note on the term exemption, talking about religious who are exempt, exempt religious, you might read about that in canon law manuals and whatnot. It means religious who are exempt from the power of the bishop in certain ways. As I recall, you have to look it up to find everything, but they still had to get, say, the faculties to hear confessions, to give absolution in that diocese. But in other ways, they were exempt from the power of the ordinary. So whether it's being used exactly in that technical sense as we know it now in this decree or not is not entirely clear. But certainly any churches that may have been exempt from having been visited before now have to be, the bishop of the diocese has to visit them. In fact, if you read some of the authors, like Fortescue talks about it, for example, they talk about all the special rubrics that would go into the bishop as he was visited, how to receive the bishop and everything is a whole ceremony. And then confirmations attached to that, it was a whole, there were rubrics for that. It wasn't just the bishop wouldn't just show up, look around in the sacristy and leave. I mean, there was a ceremony connected with this. The visitation was a ceremony. You got the idea of it, he would come in the middle of the night and just leave, and that was a visitation. Well, there are some funny stories connected with that. Anybody heard the story of Bishop Gilmore? It was actually in Pennsylvania. I believe I'm not sure what diocese he was, but this was in the 20th century, and this is a fairly relatively recent story. This bishop, his name was Gilmore, would drive himself around in a car in the diocese, and that was unusual at the time. I want to say this was maybe 1940s or 50s or something. I'm not sure when, but 20th century. And he would drive himself around alone. That was unusual, very highly unusual at the time. And he would go into all the churches of his diocese and try to find the tabernacle key, because they're supposed to be hidden so that nobody could just walk into the church and steal the tabernacle key and desecrate the Blessed Sacrament, steal the precious vessels out of the tabernacle or anything like that. So he would look everywhere. If he could find the key, he would open up the tabernacle and put a note in there saying Gilmore was here, and then leave. So the next time the priest would say Mass and open the tabernacle, he would see a note, the bishop was here and found your tabernacle key. But then one of the priests who got that note wrote to him, saying, "Thank you, Your Excellency, for letting me know that the tabernacle key wasn't hidden like it was supposed to be." And he wrote also, "I'm sure Your Excellency, before opening the tabernacle, lit 2 candles and spread the corporal in accordance with the rubrics." But apparently he hadn't. So that's not a typical Episcopal visitation. Don't get the idea that's normal. That was an unusual story from characters in Pennsylvania. Okay. All right, so back to the Council of Trent. So there was an interval between the 21st and 22nd sessions of the Council, in which the Fathers of Trent received an oath of adherence to their decrees from the Catholic Patriarch of Eastern Assyria. So there were some reconciliations of schismatics that went on here. Not ecumenism with schismatics, but reconciliation with them, who had come to Rome to obtain the confirmation of his title by the Vicar of Jesus Christ. So this is, of course, something that the Church also has power to do in the case of bishops who, like this, received their orders in schism and were considered to be patriarchs in schism. Many times the Church would, as a concession for granting, for bringing these people back to the Church, would give them confirmation, such bishops confirmation in their sees, and they would then reign as, with true ecclesiastical jurisdiction over the areas that they had previously essentially usurped. And the reason I say the Church has the power to do that is because typically, if, say, a cleric were to receive his orders in some illicit way, or of course Episcopal consecration, usually would not be permitted to exercise those orders, would be reduced to the lay state, and in that sense have his ordination annulled. Sometimes you read about that in books that talk about the history of the early Church, talking about the ordination or Episcopal consecration of some person was annulled. It doesn't mean, obviously, that the character was removed from the soul of that person, or that he lost the orders that he received. That's impossible. The mark of the sacrament is indelibly printed on the soul. But it is said annulled in the sense that they were reduced legally before the Church, reduced to the lay state, and not permitted to function as a cleric in any way. And in that sense, the ordination was annulled. Like, it was as if you had never been ordained. In that sense, annulled. Of course, the character remains on the soul, and the priest could say, approach someone who's dying and absolve that person under certain circumstances that would be licit. So of course, the Church doesn't have the power to remove the character of the soul from the person. It's indelible. That cannot be done. But you might read about ordinations being annulled in the sense of being made effectively null, as if that person had never received the ordination in the first place. And so, I bring that up because many times clerics receiving their orders illicitly would just be reduced to the lay state, have their orders effectively annulled. But the Church could also, for sufficient reason, permit those orders to still be exercised. Like there was a case of Pope Pius IX did that once. for similar motives, to bring schismatics back into the church. So the church can do that. It's a concession that the church can grant. So this patriarch of Eastern Assyria was received into the church and confirmed in his see by the Pope. So well, keep in mind the provinces of Europe were still being invaded by Protestantism. We're struggling with sacrilegious efforts to break away from Catholic unity and rush into the blood-stained path of interminable anarchy. So while all that's happening, the scattered remnants of the ancient churches of Mesopotamia and Chaldea, which were situated on the banks of the Euphrates and the Tigris, sent their patriarch to the Eternal City, meaning to Rome, to bring them back to Catholic unity and making up, in some sense, for the numbers that were being lost in places like Germany and England at this time. But of course, we have seen how the numbers were also, to some extent, being made up for in the Americas, where missionaries were going to evangelize the natives there. Which is actually Pius IV, and we're still studying the reign of Pope Pius IV, who was preceded by Pope Paul IV. Pius IV was erecting new bishoprics in America and the Indies to receive the new nations that were coming to the doors of the church. So Japan opened its eyes to the light of the faith, and China was looking out for the companions of St. Francis Xavier, because you may recall, we talked about it, that St. Francis Xavier died on the shores of China. He arrived there, he was dying, they dropped him off, and basically dumped him on the beach to die. It wasn't very nice of that captain, whoever he was. But assuming he didn't ask for that, of course. In any case, he died on the shores of China. And the church is, of course, still looking to evangelize China. But again, at Trent, still, on the 17th of September, 1562, the 22nd session was opened with 6 cardinals, 3 patriarchs, 142 bishops, and 7 generals of orders. And in this session, 9 canons were promulgated on the holy sacrifice of the Mass. If anyone saith that in the Mass a true and proper sacrifice is not offered to God, let him be anathema. So you may remember that the Novus Ordo description in the Novus Ordo Missal is originally didn't even mention sacrifice. It eventually was worked in because conservatives began to complain. But the Council of Trent issues an anathema against anybody who denies that it's a sacrifice. Then the next one, if anyone saith that by these words, do this for a commemoration of me, Christ did not institute the apostles priests, or did not ordain that they and other priests should offer Mass, offer his own body and blood, let him be anathema. So no private inspiration or personal interpretation of sacred scripture here. Thank you very much. The next one, if anyone saith that it is an imposture to celebrate Masses in honor of the saints and for obtaining their intercession with God, as the Church intends, let him be anathema. If anyone says that it's a false, evil practice, an imposture to do that, let him be anathema. To celebrate Mass in honor of the saints for obtaining the intercession of God. In fact, if you have a breviary, you may have noticed that in the section for Thanksgiving after Mass, there's even a prayer to the saint in whose honor the Mass was offered. Asking for the intercession of that saint. And then here's an interesting one. if any, well, they're all interesting, but especially for today, special applications today. If anyone saith that the ceremonies, vestments, and outward signs which the Catholic Church makes use of in the celebration of Masses are incentives to impiety rather than to devotion, let him be anathema. Anybody need any help applying that? Father Cicada mentioned once, probably the single best 3-word description of the Novus Ordo is incentives to impiety. So, draw the conclusions if you have the intelligence to do that. I'm sure everybody does, otherwise we would have problems. You probably wouldn't be here if you hadn't already drawn the conclusions. Obviously, you see what I'm driving at here. And let's not have any nonsense that it wasn't correctly promulgated or anything like that. That some I was not dotted or some T was not crossed, which is not even the case. But even if that were true, you still can't have the Catholic Church leading people to hell through false worship. If you want more on that, you can read Father Cicada's articles, which are still on the internet. So another one, if anyone saith that Masses, in which the priest alone communicates sacramentally, are unlawful, and therefore to be abrogated, let him be anathema. So it's the Protestant idea that the communion of the people is required for the Mass to be, for the Lord's Supper to be real or something. I don't even know what terms they would use, but of course, Protestants, and modernists too, of course, hate the idea of validity. So, but in Catholic terms, that would their error would be something like, a Mass in which a priest does not communicate, the priest only communicates, does not distribute Holy Communion to anyone else, those are unlawful. And yet you see that there's these ideas being worked into the Novus Ordo, even as early as the John the 23rd Missal. According to the John the 23rd rubrics, and this may surprise you, it certainly surprised me when I found out, those of you who have ever seen or been to SSPX or have any contact with them, that in the John the 23rd rubrics there is no confiteor before Holy Communion. The idea being to abolish the distinction between the communion of the celebrant and the communion of the faithful. Because, of course, we have every Sunday here the ceremony of distribution of Holy Communion outside of Mass. I'm sure you've noticed that the distribution of Holy Communion during Mass is that ceremony just inserted into the Mass. It's really a separate ceremony, just inserted into the Mass at that time. That's just the current custom. It could be done. In fact, in times past, it was done, say, after Mass. You would just have the Mass, go from start to finish with the Mass, and people would not receive communion. Then after Mass, you might have the celebrant or another priest, depending on the situation, come out and do the distribution of Holy Communion in a totally separate ceremony after the Mass. That was done. So it's just currently, the current practice is to do it during Mass, so the celebrant doesn't have to come out and start a separate ceremony. I mean, it's perfect. I mean, it's permitted by the rubrics. There's nothing wrong with that. Obviously, there's a certain liberty there. But that's why we can do it outside of Mass. And so if you read a lot of the older, not even necessarily older ones, but if you read authors, they all actually assume that you're not doing the distribution of Holy Communion during Mass. So if you want to find out, if you want to read the rubrics for what you do, what we do all the time, what you pretty much, anybody who calls himself a traditional Catholic, the practice he's familiar with, if you want to find that, you have to look in the back of the book, say, oh, this is, by the way, this is what you do if you do it during Mass. Because all the authors presume that it was just not done. But again, you see it creeping back, this really a Protestant idea, creeping into the Novus Ordo, and even as early as the John the 23rd rubrics. Because that's the confiteor that starts the new ceremony, or really a separate ceremony within the Mass for the distribution of Holy Communion of the people. And whereas in the John the 23rd, the idea was to make that's a necessary part of the Mass. So why do we need to mark the beginning of a different ceremony, basically with the confiteor? Why do you have a separate Domini non sum dignus? The celebrant, that's another thing, is that the Domini non sum dignus, the celebrant, of course, standing in front of the people, holding up the host, saying, Ecce agnus Dei, etc., that was also abolished, John the 23rd. The idea being it's all just one communion. The celebrant and the people, it's all just receiving Holy Communion, a necessary part of the Mass. Or at the very least, integral. So, and that's so again, if you've ever seen SSPX, I was surprised when I found out myself that was actually abolished in the rubrics. And also a similar thing, if you've ever been to, if you have never seen anything besides the 1955 Holy Week, the new Holy Week, which again, if that's all you've ever seen, when you see the traditional Holy Week for the first time, it's like a similar experience to what people describe in going to the traditional Mass for the first time. It's very similar. I know, because my first time was here, and I saw the traditional Holy Week. It's very similar to that. It's like a whole other world that you never knew existed. Just like people, when they go, all they've known is the Novus Ordo, they go to the traditional Mass for the first time, they all have a similar reaction, some reaction like, so this is the Mass. It was a similar reaction, okay, so this is Holy Week. And a lot of people have the same reaction. Because the Novus Ordo, 1955 Holy Week, is very much, it fits in very nicely with the Novus Ordo. One of St. Pius X once listed as one demand that the modernists had in his time was to have the distribution of Holy Communion for the people on Good Friday. And that was added in the 1955 Holy Week. So while we're on the subject of the rubrics of Holy Communion, I thought I'd mention that. That's something that obviously the Church permitted it under Pope Pius XII, who was, of course, a true pope. So we can't say that it's an intrinsically evil practice or anything, of course. But it's just something that modernists wanted, and they got under Pius XII. Shows you the direction that things were heading. Okay, now back to the anathemas of Trent. If anyone saith that the rite of the Roman Church, according to which a part of the canon and the words of consecration are pronounced in a low tone, is to be condemned, or that the Mass ought to be celebrated in the vulgar tongue only. By the way, that means in the vernacular. It doesn't mean only using foul language. Protestants wouldn't even say that. In the vulgar tongue only, mean the vernacular only. Or that water ought not to be mixed with the wine that is to be offered in the chalice, on the ground that it is contrary to the institution of Christ, let him be anathema. So also going back a bit to the idea that people have to receive Holy Communion during the Mass. The Novus Ordo actually has a distinction between Masses that are offered when people are present and when people are not present. Whereas, of course, the rubrics of the Church approves, there's no distinction. The Mass is the Mass. It's essentially a public act of worship, whether there are a large number of people there or only one server, or even just the celebrant himself. Sometimes priests end up having to say Mass by themselves with no server. It's still essentially a public act of worship. The celebrant still says Dominus Vobiscum. It's still a public act of worship. The Novus Ordo has some distinction there. And but even, I should say, in the rubrics of the breviary, those who are not yet ordained deacon do not say Dominus Vobiscum in a private recitation. They say Domine exaudi oratione meam et clamor meus adite veniat, because it's not considered the public prayer of the Church until a deacon is reciting it. Someone who is in major orders, having received a divinely instituted order. The subdiaconate appears to have been instituted by the Church. In fact, at one time was even considered a minor order, but that's a whole nother that's a whole nother subject. Very interesting, but really getting a little too far off track for today. So I mean, it's not like that there's absolutely no basis between liturgical prayer versus a subdeacon. The divine office is liturgical prayer, but it's not really considered to be like the official liturgical public prayer of the Church until at least a deacon is reciting it. To subdeacons always have to recite the office there, but they have to say Domine exaudi oratione meam instead. There's no problem with that, obviously, but the idea that a priest, a priest offering Mass, not just a priest reciting the office, but a priest offering Mass when there's nobody present, has to modify the rubrics because it's not considered a public act anymore. Again, has its roots in Protestant ideas. And then a Protestant idea that the canon and the words of consecration should be pronounced out loud. That's the Novus Ordo. In fact, it was even under don't think it was under Pius XII, but John the 23rd and Paul VI. Those things. It wasn't like after John the 23rd died, the Novus Ordo suddenly sprang up. They were still or Pius XII. John the 23rd and Paul VI. They were continually made changes until the Novus Ordo Missal was finally dropped in its completed form. But there were practices began like the celebrant would sing the Libera, the prayer as the celebrant holds the paten on the side on the altar, the Liberanos, Quesimus Domine, etc. That eventually was worked in that the celebrant had to sing that, whereas in the traditional rubrics it's always done silently, in the silent voice, the voice that's audible only to the celebrant. So again, you see that there were Protestant ideas influencing the development of the Novus Ordo, which really should come as a surprise to nobody, but here you're seeing more in detail just to what extent that is. And interesting, the idea that saying that water should not be added to the wine for Mass, not too much, obviously. A third or more would invalidate the matter, depending on the strength of the wine, but there has to be there has to be a small amount, at least relative to the amount of wine in the chalice at the offertory. But in fact, it's a mortal sin not to add that drop of water. In itself, it's just it's supposed to be a small drop of water, but in itself, to omit that is, in itself, it's just a tiny drop of water, but to omit that is a mortal sin, a grave violation of the rubrics. Okay, so, and then, as we've been talking about, each one of these canons, it will be seen, so we'll see it more specifically later, meets some of the errors which Protestantism was laboring to popularize in Germany. The decree of Reformation regarding the morals of the clergy comprised 11 chapters in this session. So it's a lot. Bishops were admonished to watch over the life, propriety of conduct of their clergy. Severe penalties were decreed against the despoilers of churches and the usurpers of ecclesiastical property or revenues. There was the arrival of the Cardinal of Lorraine as the ambassador of King Charles IX induced the fathers to delay the next session until his appearance at Trent. So now the King of France wants things delayed for political reasons. And by this time, the council is in a type of crisis. The question on the sacrament of holy orders gave rise to a discussion on the institution of bishops. So the question was, where do bishops derive their jurisdiction from? From Christ immediately or through the Pope? So it was to be determined whether the institution is divine or whether bishops held their mission immediately from the Pope. Actually, Pius XII, again, this book was written of course, the council in itself, the 16th century, but this book was written in the 19th century, so some things Darras needs some updating. Darras didn't have certain definitions, various documents at his disposal simply because they hadn't been published yet, promulgated by popes who came after him, or at least after he wrote. But Pius XII came down on the side of, he didn't seem to define it, as I recall, but he talked about it in an encyclical, asserting it in an encyclical, that bishops receive their jurisdiction through the Pope, that they're more than just simply agents of the Pope, like apostolic vicars, that they are true pastors in each in his own diocese, but that they receive their jurisdiction through the Pope, that it comes through the Pope to them. So, according to Darras, no preceding article had ever excited more lively discussions or more animated expressions of opinion. So, in other words, they got heated over this one. One author named Pallavicini says that so violent was the storm that the hopes hitherto entertained of peace in the church were changed into despair. So they got really riled up over this. It needed all the tact and the virtue of St. Charles Borromeo, his patience, his united gentleness and firmness, his ascendant over the mind of the Pope, his uncle, in other words, his influence over the mind of, over Pope Pius IV, and his winning influence exerted upon the legates and the fathers of the council to restore the opposite parties to harmony. So they got so worked up that it took a saint to calm them down and get back to work. The discussion was for a moment interrupted by the arrival of the Cardinal of Lorraine, we saw earlier, who was received with extraordinary honors. So they had some interruption there. There was he gave a discourse on the duties of the council and the hopes which its convocation gave to the countries of Europe that still remained Catholic. But then, after that, the deliberations on the institutions of bishops were then resumed, presumably in all their fury, with St. Charles Borromeo doing everything in his power to bring it under control. So they all agreed that the power of orders, of course, that comes through apostolic succession, episcopal consecration, but opinions were divided upon the origin of their jurisdiction. So again, the idea was, what do they receive their jurisdiction directly from Christ or through the Pope? Some said that it was referred immediately to Christ, so conferred immediately by Christ, while others maintained that it is communicated to them only immediately through the sovereign pontiff. Again, we see it was centuries later, but Pope Pius XII came down on the side of that. But there was the council, the Council of Trent, seems never to have actually made a definition on that. The Cardinal of Lorraine decided to silence the debate. I guess it was getting too heated and not going anywhere. He decided to silence these. They were speculative debates. Of course, everybody acknowledges that a bishop can't start operating in a diocese without the approval of the Pope, and that every legitimately constituted bishop does, in fact, exercise jurisdiction in his diocese, and that the power of orders comes, of course, from Christ through the apostolic succession with regard to orders. But yeah, it's speculative. It doesn't resolving this wouldn't change anything on the practical order, on the practical level. So the Cardinal of Lorraine said that the heretics profit by your intestine dissensions to extend their ravages. So he's saying that by all this essentially intramural, domestic strife, if you will, among not only Catholics but the fathers of the council, all of this internal strife is just giving the Protestants opportunity to extend their ravages, because while everybody else is distracted with the speculative question, real problems are on the ground. Real practical problems are spreading like wildfire. So he got them to just put it aside for the moment. Let's just deal with the things that heretics are saying now. We can deal with the speculative questions later. Not to say that it's an unimportant question, of course, that it's not something that should be discussed, but for one thing, under circumstances, it will actually lead to some kind of question, some kind of resolution to the question, and also not when you have heretics knocking at the door. That was his point. He said, they maintained that the prelates instituted by the Pope are not true and lawful bishops. This is what must be directly condemned, instead of raising idle and endless discussions. So again, not to say that it's a pointless question to discuss, but he's saying that there's no great practical application for that in the moment. All Catholics agree that all legitimately constituted bishops have to be approved by the Pope. But everybody agrees on that. But we also all agree that there's a real problem with heretics trying to overthrow those bishops. And that's the more immediate problem that we need to deal with. So they finally adopted that course. The Fathers of the Council finally agreed to put aside the question for the moment and focus on condemning Protestants instead. But then seems that a number of people connected with the council suddenly died, so perhaps there was another attack of the plague or something. But the Cardinal of Mantua died and then also a cardinal by the name of Seripando. So Cardinal Seripando also died, as well as, so you had two cardinals who were at the council who suddenly died, as well as the legates, so both legates and the presidents of the council. So that caused obvious delays in the proceedings. When you have sudden deaths of high-profile figures like that, there's going to be some delay for no other reason than for their funerals, but also for administrative reasons. Pius IV appointed Cardinals Morone and Navagero in their stead, so two cardinals died, two more were sent to replace them. The new legates were, and he doesn't even get their names, doesn't give their names, but apparently they were remarkable for their prudence and thorough knowledge of men, which is of course good when you have a large meeting of people, even if they are ecclesiastics. Human failures and frailties and tendencies toward pride don't go away when they have holy orders. They should overcome those things, but effectively, those defects remain, especially when you have a large number of people like this. So they were known for that, as well as for their devotion to the interests of the Holy See. And so the Holy Father had reason to expect that they would do their jobs. Again, unlike we see certain legates in the past, there were people who were, on multiple occasions, it wasn't only one or two isolated instances, that happened repeatedly, legates betraying their trust and granting things that they should not have granted, so that the Pope would be in the embarrassing position not only of having his legates betray him, but having to reverse their decisions, or never give approval to them in the first place, but officially disown their decisions, formally disown them, and then issue his condemnation of his own. But that happened. Legates going to Constantinople in the earlier centuries would grant things either contrary to faith or morals that, of course, nobody can really grant. And the Pope would have to fire them, probably throw them in prison or something, and then enact decisions contrary to what they had said.